My name is Byron Johnson. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion. Thank you for coming to today's lecture. You are in for a special treat. Stephen Post has been a friend of mine for many years, and we are thrilled that we could talk him into coming to campus to give a lecture today. He's also a good friend of a number of the folks at ISR, including Jeff Levin and Gordon Melton and Rodney Stark. And Steve and I met a long time ago through a mutual friend, David Larson, and a lot of the great work that David Larson did in the Washington, D.C. area. Stephen's vita is massive, and his bio is about as long as most people's CV. So I'm not going to read it to you. It would take me too long. He's a fellow in multiple societies. He builds fantastic centers. He was at Case Western for many years, and he's at Stony Brook now, where he's built a fabulous operation in the School of Medicine. He's at home in so many different disciplines, and so he hasn't met a discipline yet that he hasn't wanted to conquer. And so be it theology and religious studies or ethics, he's one of the top bioethicists in the world. And but I don't want to take any of his time away from the lecture and the Q&A that we'll have toward the end. So would you join me in welcoming Stephen Post?
Thank you, Byron. Thank you, everybody here at Baylor, for having me here this afternoon on such a beautiful day. Baylor is a wonderful place, and I'm honored to be here to share a few thoughts. So this is a Norman Rockwell painting. Now, some of you who are a little younger than I am, you may not really know much about Norman Rockwell. He spent most of his time up in Vermont, and then he moved down to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. He painted in the 1940s and 50s primarily, and he caught America in a very special period. A lot of his artwork showed up on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. No relationship, by the way. And this particular image is the Golden Rule, which in my view, simply stated, far, far surpasses anything that we really have in contemporary ethical theory. It's part of all the great perennial spiritual traditions for good reason. And notice, this isn't the minimalist view of the Golden Rule. You know what that is. Do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. That doesn't take too much. For example, I can get home tonight to the Courtyard Marriott here in Waco, and if I haven't elbowed some innocent wayfarer in the ribs, I can feel justified. Fairly minimalistic thinking, wouldn't you say? But the Golden Rule in its positive, more idealistic, more loving dimensions, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It requires us to use our moral imaginations, our spirituality, our vision, to ask ourselves, how can I contribute to the lives of the people around me? And if you look at this picture, take a gander at some of the details of it. First of all, there are people from every generation here. Old and young, middle-aged. There are men, there are women. There are people from every conceivable ethnic and cultural background. There's the Jewish rabbi. There in the middle, I assume you've got a nice secular existentialist in a blue jean shirt scratching his chin. See? He might have read Jean-Paul Sartre's great work, Being in Nothingness, and maybe he got to that long section called The Look, which tells you whenever anybody is kind to you, watch out because they're just after your wallet or your pocketbook, as the case may be. Well, that kind of very cynical thinking was so much a part of the 20th century. But even he, I'm attributing a little bit, by the way, even he is thinking to himself, what can I do to contribute to the lives of others? So whether people are theological or philosophical, sacred or secular in their dispositions, this rule has a lot of value. Also, look at the facial expressions, because I think all of these individuals have a kind of serenity or tranquility about them. Rockwell painted this very purposefully. Think about some of the images you might know from the great saints of history. There is a sense in which they are at peace. They are loving, but they are also at peace. That's the golden rule. Nowadays, fast forward, Jorge Moll and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health took people just about like you and me, any age, over 18, into the laboratory. He hooked them up to PET scan devices. He gave them a menu of charities that they might consider contributing to. Your alma mater, your faith community, the Alzheimer's Association, Mended Hearts, who knows what it might be. When an individual has a eureka moment, I'd like to contribute to that organization, they would check a box next to that line item on the menu. And when they did that, a part of their brain would light up. What part of it? Well, the very deeply evolved emotional part of the brain, actually a part of the brain called the mesolimbic system. And that's the part of the brain that's associated with experiences of joy and delight, and that doles out one of the 4 feel-good chemicals, dopamine. So think about that. You're just contemplating, like those people in that Rockwell picture, the possibility of doing unto others, of loving your neighbor as yourself. And there's something going on deep inside. To me, that's good to know. There's a passage in Psalms, those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. You don't need to let that law of tit-for-tat reciprocity hang over your neck like some sword of Damocles, limiting you in this pay-me-back mentality. Pay it forward, because guess what? The benefits are internal. When I got to Stony Brook after 20 years in Shaker Heights, Ohio, an inner-ring suburb of Cleveland, where I raised a couple of wonderful kids, I got a call from one of the largest managed care systems in the country, United Healthcare. And they wanted to know, okay, is all this business that it's good to be good, that, thinking about others and not just focusing on the problems of the self, that might actually be good for your emotional and physical health? How can we check this out? So we did a national survey, something people at ISR do often. 5,500 Americans 18 and older. Did you volunteer in 2009? This was done in the beginning of 2010, okay? In 2009, so it's looking back a year, did you volunteer? 41% of Americans said, yes, I volunteered. How much did you volunteer? About 100 hours a year, which, give or take, means a couple of hours a week. So not high thresholds of volunteering, but just enough to sort of get you in the spirit of things. And then we asked these questions. Well, did it make you happier? 96% of the respondents said, yeah, made me happier. That's pretty good, because in the big international happiness scales that are run out of the University of Lancaster in the UK, the US is slipping down there below number 30. Places like Mozambique are up there at 3 or 4. They don't have a lot, They're not living in what I'll call affluenza, where you seek happiness by going out to the nearest mall to get yet another pair of $200 designer jeans at Abercrombie's. No, I don't say that. What I mean is, we live in a world where anxiety and depression rates for adolescents have gone up tenfold since 1960. When I arrived at Stony Brook in July of 2010, the big headline sequence of stories in the New York Post was about NYU students jumping off the roof of the library, copycat style. Total despair, total emptiness. And look, right? Volunteering, just a couple of hours a week, and 96% of people are saying, makes me happier. 68% say make me physically healthier. Now, in medical research, this kind of self-reported information is taken very seriously so long as it's anonymous and people have no reason to bias their answers. This is all done anonymously. What does this mean? If you've ever been spending a whole week eating donuts, you sort of feel a bit listless and devoid of energy for all kinds of metabolic reasons. And then you shift suddenly to an all-protein diet for a couple of days, I guarantee you will feel a boost of energy. People are saying that they feel a boost of energy when they involve themselves in this kind of thing. 78% say it helps them with recovery from loss and disappointment. Life ain't easy. World's been burning since the world's been turning. We all have peaks and valleys. And here it is. Volunteering helps almost 80% of people recover from loss and disappointment. Less trouble sleeping, reduced anxiety, better friendships. Sometimes I ask people, who are your friends? Well, they're the people I party with. That's Aristotle's lowest form of friendship. His highest form of friendship are friends who are the ones who sit with you and they share your values, your faith, your commitments, your spirituality, and you can trust them to keep you on course if you start to veer away from that course, right? Notice 25% of people were volunteering through their workplace. This is actually a business school we're in. So I once got an email from a guy in Vancouver who owns a big mall. He wanted to know if any of this was true. So he went to all of the stores that rented space in his mall, and there were 30 or 40 of them. And he said, okay, give everybody who works for you 2 hours off a week, paid, just to do the most creative thing for others, to love their neighbors in the best way they know how, okay? And do it for 6 weeks. So they did it for 6 weeks. And then they did happiness scales. They found that all the employees were much more joyful. They found life more gratifying. Their depression rates were lower. Business picked up by 13%, maybe because people were more engaged with clients, right? Think about it. Not a bad deal. This is beautiful stuff. If you could take this and create a compound and sell it at your drugstore, I guarantee you would be a multi-billionaire overnight. But you don't need a compound, because guess what? It's not what lies behind you or what lies before you that matters, but what lies within you. And this lies within you. And all you need to, you don't need to go up to the Colorado mountains to Shambhala and meditate for 40 days with advanced Tibetans. All you need to do is reach out and love your neighbor. Not bad. St. Paul said God loves a cheerful giver. And Jesus said 'tis better to give than to receive. Shakespeare got that in The Merchant of Venice. Quality of mercy is twice blessed. Carl Menninger, founder of the Menninger Clinic, one of the great psychiatrists of our time, he said, love cures both those who receive it and those who give it. You've got to start thinking about this. Serenity and oxytocin. Remember that picture, that Rockwell picture? Okay. People look pretty serene, pretty placid. Turns out that when you do face-to-face helping, the brain also releases a chemical, a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is uncontroversially associated with feelings, again, of inner tranquility. So these are Stony Brook stitchers. These are friends of mine. Some of them, a couple of them undesignated will note cancer survivors. Some of them just helping knit pillows and scarves and mittens for people going to the cancer center for treatment. And you look at them, and you see that serenity that I think Rockwell so carefully observed with the eyes of a great artist. So this is real. This is real. This kind of thing is real. First time I'm aware of the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself coming into world literature is in Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I've always been intrigued by what comes before it. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's a wonderful book on your shelf, Byron, by Michael McCullough, Beyond Revenge, and he points out some very interesting studies showing that when the brain gets focused on compassionate and empathic activities, it actually shuts down the neural pathways that are associated with bitterness, hostility, rumination, and all these destructions that we know are so harmful because they keep the adrenal gland turned on in a protracted way year after year sometimes, and they actually cause heart disease because metabolites convert into fatty acids. This kind of emotional state is also associated with hippocampal atrophy as a form of dementia and with slower wound healing. You want to get away from those destructive emotions? Love your neighbor. So Redford Williams was the chairman of the Department of Cardiology at Duke University for a long time, and he had a pretty interesting idea in the 1990s. Now, some of you in this room, have you ever heard of the MMPI? Yeah, some of you. Okay, yeah. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And it's been around actually since the late 30s. It's got a long history. So it's like 300, 350 questions. I actually took it once because I was doing some clinical pastoral care education. So you take all this battery of questions, and then you sit down with a mentor who kind of tells you, well, Post, you got some strengths here, but here's a few areas where you might be careful. So what Williams did was he selected 27 questions from the MMPI that he associated with hostility. Again, unforgiving, uncaring, ruminating, dredging up old resentments, quick-tempered, prone to expletives, et cetera, et cetera. You can Google this. There's probably about 1 million references to the hostility scale. And he said, okay, let's look at some retrospective data. Turns out, so he looks at people who are 25 years of age, and it's 1950. And then he says, okay, what about their death rates, their mortality rates, by 1975, when they're now 50 years of age? So they're still relatively young adults, in a sense. Okay, the high quartile hostiles had a mortality rate of 20%. 1 out of 5 of them were dead. Deader than doornails, primarily of what? Of heart disease. They had a few other issues too, but that was the main issue. And again, that's because under these stressful emotions, the adrenal enlarges, it's pumping out cortisol, and it's destroying your vasculature over time. It's like acid on metal. What about the low hostiles, the low quartile hostiles? 2% mortality rate. So this actually changed American cardiology, and it's been very well duplicated with different methodologies that sort of converge on the same point. When I was a boy growing up, people said, you're going to be susceptible to heart disease because you're multitasking all the time, which I was, and you're also trying to get from point A to point B in a hurry. The New York strut. And then as they said, well, and also, you want to be careful of, hostile, temperamental kinds of moments and all that. It's okay. So now no one says that. Now here's the issue. If after this presentation you get in your cars, how many of you have cars? Okay. And if the person on, is it Washington Avenue? Yeah? If the person in front of you has the audacity to slow down at a yellow light, and you fall full-chested on your horn and yell out an expletive, then you've got a problem. Okay? So this stuff is real. And when Leviticus tells us, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge, but love your neighbor as yourself. It's great for your neighbors. It's even better for you. What about kids? Little picture of my son Andrew about 8 or 9 years ago in Shaker Heights, graduating from his grade school. Paul Bloom of the Yale Child Studies Center has just published this book, already a bestseller, Just Babies. Interesting stuff. He's the guy who's been doing all these studies with puppets. You've been reading about them. So, you take one pup, you take 300 or 400 toddlers, 12 to 18 months old. You wonder, do they have any kind of sensibility about being good Samaritans? I mean, could this stuff possibly be a bit wired into them? So you got the first puppet climbs up the incline, gets just about to the top, struggles, for stability, and then slides down. And each puppet is completely different. The first puppets are big, round, purple things with googly eyes. And then there's a next puppet that comes up that follows the first puppet on the next try and just kind of helps that puppet get up to the plateau and gets up himself or herself. And that's a big green square puppet with a big mane. So these things are very distinguishable. That's your good Sam puppet. And then there's a third puppet in skit 3 who comes up, and just as the first puppet is about to get on the plateau, pulls it down. That's Mean Jack. Okay? So then they take these toddlers independently. Okay, so there's no groupthink going on here. And they lay out the 3 puppets in front of them. 92% of the toddlers either reach toward, touch, or strongly gaze at the second puppet, the Good Samaritan. Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil. It's there. The question is, what buttons do we push? What role modeling do we do? How do we enculturate our children into a life of neighbor love? So one of the things that I find amazing is this study that goes way back to the University of California at Berkeley, the mid-1920s. They took about 300 preteens, that's another word for a 12-year-old, and they asked them, hey, what makes you tick? What gets you up? And 100 of them say, well, I want to use my gifts to help humanity. I want to use my talents to make a difference in the world. Then they follow these kids every 10 years of their lives, throughout their lives, pretty much. And they do psychological tests, they look at their medical records. Turns out that the 1/3 who had that kind of Samaritan motivation, they have lower levels of heart disease, significantly lower levels of depression. And what's now being looked at with quite a lot of interest is who's still alive, because, hey, they're well into their 90s. Well, turns out that the majority of the ones who are still alive come from the 1/3 who is 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds indicated that they wanted to use their lives to help their neighbors. That doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to good people. That you can't be a wonderfully motivated individual and get a terrible diagnosis at age 24 or get rammed into by a Ram 1500. It can happen. But as a scientific generalization, it's pretty good to be good. What are the models? I don't know. It might just be that people stay out of trouble. It might be that they tend to go into more fruitful areas with regard to career and professional life. There could be a lot of different interpretations for this, but the bottom line is that this kind of behavior it provides a protective halo that follows a young person their whole life long. So it's great, be helping your neighbor, but as a byproduct, as an unintended side effect, paradoxically, it also tends to be an awfully healthy way to live. These are the lymph notes of Stony Brook Medical School. I don't know what they were doing when they were 12 years of age, but I couldn't resist throwing this in. Kind of looks like an old Beatles album called Abbey Road. I took this picture, but anyway, I just think some of them, anyway, some high percentage of them, were fortunate enough probably to have good role models as kids and to be engaged in helping behavior, probably with their families. Because volunteering isn't just good for the individual, it's actually good for families. Now let's talk about alcoholism. Okay, quick picture here. That guy on the right is Bill W., one of the nastiest people living in Brooklyn ever known. Drunk as a skunk every night, narcissistic, treated everybody with foul language and violence, and lost his job as a stock analyst. So he's in Bellevue Hospital in the detox unit, and he sees a light, he says. He sees a light. David Brooks wrote a whole column about this 2 years ago in the New York Times. He sees a light, and it was, in his view, the light of God, the light of Christ, and he never took another drink. And 6 months later, he got his job back. He's doing okay. So they decided to take a risk. They sent him to Akron, Ohio on a business trip to get together with some people who might be investors. Well, it's 1934, and the Depression. The trip didn't work out terribly well, and so Bill W. was in the foyer of the Mayflower Hotel, downtown Akron. He's saying to himself, as he's looking at the bar across the hallway, I'm gonna drink. And then it comes to him, no. So he takes $1 out of his wallet and he walks up to the bartender and he says, give me 20 nickels. The bartender gives him 20 nickels. He goes to the telephone booths in the foyer, and next to the telephone booths is a list on the wall of rabbis and ministers in Akron, and he calls every one of them. To the 19th one, Reverend Tubbs, Presbyterian minister. He says, Reverend Tubbs, I know this is probably the strangest phone call you've ever gotten, but my name's Bill W., and I'm from New York, and I'm an alcoholic. And I know I can't control this. I can't get better unless I can help another alcoholic. So Tubbs says, well, I got just the person for you. Dr. Bob, who was an alcoholic surgeon at Akron General Hospital. So he calls the family matron of a family in Akron that owned Firestone Rubber, who was really interested in the fate of alcoholics. And she got Bill W. and Dr. Bob together in the carriage house of their estate, which is now a national monument to AA. And for 3 days they sat and they figured out the 12 steps, which have saved the lives of more than 40 million people and have done more for alcoholics than any medicine on the face of the earth ever could or ever would or ever will. And they say in AA, our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others and how we may help their needs. Think about that. It also says we heal on the dual axes of spirituality and altruism. There's something about getting into that modality of the love of God and of neighbor as self, that triadic love that seems to work in the 12-step programs. So one of my colleagues, Maria Pagano, who's now working actually with Byron Johnson on some projects of great importance, in my opinion, she wanted to know how much does helping others contribute to recovery. If you go to an AA meeting, anyone ever been to an AA meeting? Just as a visitor or whatever? Some of you know what it's like. They have open meetings, they invite the public in occasionally to just kind of learn a little bit about it. There's a greeter at the door. There's someone putting out the chairs. There's someone making the coffee. There's someone passing out literature. There's someone giving a testimony, right? They're all doing things positively. That's the 12th step, but it's non-sequential. So as soon as you go into AA, you're 12th stepping, right? And it turns out that alcoholics who are high in their helping activities, if you follow them for 1 year after going dry, 40% of them are still dry. The ones who are not high on 12-stepping have a 22% recovery rate. So headline is, you double the likelihood of recovering from alcoholism if you help other alcoholics. You know, Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist, spoke about the helper therapy principle. This is the helper therapy principle in action. And also, by the way, you saw lower depression rates in individuals who were high helpers. So this is a prescription. This is a clinical prescription, in a sense. And we need to think of it in those ways. Our very lives depend on our constant thought of others. Go back to Rockwell, our constant thought of others. You might be a rabbi, you might be a Hindu, you might be a secular existentialist. Put your mind on what you can do to help others. It's awfully good for you. I had the opportunity to get to know a woman who was once awarded the Templeton Prize. This is Dr. Cicely Saunders. How many of you have heard of hospice? Okay, well, then you may not know, but she invented hospice. She created the first hospice in world history, St. Christopher's Hospice in London, in about 1962. And she actually coined the term. Okay, because in medieval Europe, when you were a traveler and you were going over hill and valley, you needed a place to stay. And that would usually be, you know, some little lean-to area next to a convent or a chapel or whatever it might be. And that was called a hospice. So she used her analogical imagination, and she said, you know, dying is a journey. So she appropriated the word hospice. And she trained over 2,000 leaders of hospices all over the world, including almost every founder of a hospice in the United States. She was phenomenal, right? And she came to a conference we had at MIT on empathy, altruism, and agape love, Christian love, a symposium on science and religion, October 1999. And I was chairing the conference, and I invited her over, and she gave the dinner speech. And she said, I'm 83 years of age, and I get up every morning, and I go to St. Christopher's, and I just do something really menial, like changing bedpans for a while. And then she said, I sit on the ends of the beds of people who are dying. And she said, you know, sometimes when people are dying, they second guess their lives. Oh, if I'd only taken that other path 30 years ago, right? Things would have been different. She sits and listens, and she's non-judgmental. She lets them have their narrative. She doesn't interrupt them. She just respectfully would listen and be present emotionally. And she said, when people are listened to, they feel loved, and they feel that their lives have significance, because she said the greatest problem for people who are dying is that they somehow feel that their life rested on some cosmic mistake. They might not have had a sense that it's love that underlies reality and that reveals itself through Christ and through the lives of so many great people who truly understand the love of God. Not everybody has that, so people wonder, does my life rest on a mistake? And so she's there, and she's affirming people in their journey. And you know, when I was around her, and I got to know her pretty well, she combined a lot of positive psychological assets, or what others might prefer to call fruits of the Spirit. She had an inner freedom about her, a gaiety that was more than happiness. It wasn't just dependent on external circumstances, because she went through so much persecution. People fired guns into her picture window because they thought the idea that someone could die without a tube in every orifice, natural and unnatural, was unethical. Right? So a heroic woman. A joy that was deeper than happiness, a hope that was deeper than optimism, something very profound about her. And if you look at clinicians these days, I know some of you may be planning one day to be doctors or nurses or medical social workers, I hope. A lot of people in these professions indicate that they've lost enthusiasm for their professional lives. The main reason, almost 90%, is because they just don't have the opportunity to connect with their patients empathically. Think about that. Physicians who do connect with their patients have less stress, burnout, substance abuse, suicide attempts. So you see what I'm saying? It's good to be good. It's great for patients, but it's also really great for clinicians. When I think of medical care, there's sort of external care. Do it right, get the butterfly needle in my arm once, please, and don't have to repeat that 3 times. There's cognitive empathy, attentive listening and affirmation. There's also the emotional engagement, affective empathy, which I thought Cicely Saunders had in spades. And there's compassionate care, which is a kind of amplification of empathy under conditions of patient suffering. So my point is that's real good, not just for patients, but for doctors and nurses and social workers. House to the contrary. Depression. So some colleagues of mine did a nice study on widows and widowers, people married for a long time, presumably happily. And here they are, and they're dealing with bereavement. Well, the ones who can report significant informal helping activities in their neighborhoods and their families, they're getting through grief quicker and in a more stable and enduring fashion. So I got a call from some organization on Long Island. I happen to be marooned on an island right now. Asked me if I would do a talk. It was an organization of widows and widowers. They wanted me to do this presentation at their annual meeting. So I said, okay. So I went to some big restaurant with a sort of hotel with a big room and a conference room, and I gave this talk, and it went pretty well. There was a lot of Q&A, and then afterwards, toward the end, some guy stood up in the back of the room, and he said, "Hey, I don't care what you say, buddy. I don't do nothing for nothing." And I knew I wasn't in Cleveland anymore. Point is, don't worry about pay it back, pay it forward. That's the thing. That's why Jesus said, go and do likewise. He said, go and do likewise. That kind of second formulation of the golden rule in his thought. Go and do likewise. Happier Communities, the Foresight think tank in England, the 400 highest level British epidemiologists and so forth. They want to know what makes people happier in cities and suburbs and rural areas across the UK. One of the 5 key factors: lowering depression rates, elevating well-being, giving to neighbors and communities. On the same theme of mental health and wellness, this is a picture of Hopewell. It's a therapeutic farm in Mesopotamia, Ohio, near the Pennsylvania border. That's not the old Mesopotamia, okay? Although I will tell you that in 592 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Mesopotamia invaded the Syrians, right? Something like that. Anyway, this is Mesopotamia, Ohio, and Hopewell is a 300-acre farm. And people are referred there from the Menninger Clinic in Houston, from McLean Hospital in Boston, from all over the country. And what do? They, first of all, it's spiritually based. They have clinical pastoral care. They address deep probing issues with folks, including folks with significant schizophrenia: trust, meaning, purpose in life, forgiveness, gratitude, fundamental notions that make a life successful. They're near nature, of course. They do a whole lot of farming. I spent a day with them, with this group, about a month ago, and I went out with them in the early morning to get the eggs out of the chicken coop. I met their little piglets They raise pigs and they harvest these things. They bale the hay, they milk the cows. It was great. They get up in the morning. It's not authoritative. It's just sort of the expectation of the community. When you come into the community, you want to do something to contribute to the lives of others. Again, it's the wounded healer notion. Because I have an experience of mental illness, I can help other people with that condition. Now, they do have a psychiatrist who comes in every couple of weeks and meets everyone, and they do use medications. But it's much more than that. So if you look at their website, acceptance, home, community, nature, spirit, daily routine of benevolent work, healthy diet. Does this sound strange to you? It shouldn't. I'll tell you why in a minute. By the way, in terms of environment, this is a great study. People waking up post-surgically, each group, the controls and the subjects, have a window. The controls wake up to a window with nothing behind it but a brick wall, kind of not so great. And the controls have a beautiful view of trees. Well, the subjects, the ones who have the view of the trees, had shorter hospital stays, implying less stress and faster wound healing, high cortisol rates, slow wound healing by about 20%, if anybody needs to know that. Less pain, probably because they're releasing more endorphins, which are the natural palliative chemicals in the body. Fewer minor complications, better emotional well-being. Not bad. Not bad. And this has been replicated a whole lot. It's actually the first study that begins Esther Sternberg's great magnum opus called Healing Spaces. They got it all going on there. But guess what? This is how American psychiatry began. It wasn't just pushing pills. They didn't have any. So what did they do? You look at all these great asylums on the eastern coast of the United States. They used these values. They were founded by Christians. Friends Hospital in Philadelphia was founded by Thomas Scattergood and Kirkbride, both the co-founders of the American Psychiatric Association. And they believed in this system. They called it moral treatment, healing by living with a moral, ordered existence if treated with kindness, dignity, and respect. And they even hired Olmstead, Frederick Olmstead, who designed the grounds of Central Park in New York City, to design the grounds for these facilities. So they all have 200, 300-acre facilities. Even the Connecticut Asylum, now the Institute for Living, has acres and acres of things going on there. And people go out and they have activities that are meaningful for the community. So this is another good example of that little passage. Those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. I have a definition of love, by the way. I like the word agape, but sometimes not everybody speaks Greek. Have you ever noticed? So I struggle with that. I take the definition from a famous psychiatrist who was at the University of Chicago for many years. You should Google this guy, Harry Stack Sullivan. And this is what he said. He said, when the happiness, security, and well-being of another is as real or meaningful to you as your own, you love that person. So think about yourself, looking over the crib of a child, having a quiet moment of companionship with a close friend. Cicely Saunders with a person who's dying. Jean Vanier with a person with cognitive disabilities. People who are called to serve in these constituencies of needful individuals. That's what we're talking about, that kind of love. Not the love of designer shoes or chocolate or something like that. And Harry Stack Sullivan himself was 22 years old. He was in medical school. He had a schizophrenic break. He had to leave medical school. He went back to Vermont, to his little town. And he stayed there for 2 or 3 years. And he found that he could recover because he was doing things. He was in a stable social network. And people helped him figure out what was real and what wasn't. He would ask them, is that person real? Is that person not real? Did you ever see the movie A Beautiful Mind about the Harvard professor? Yeah, you know, Russell Crowe plays John Nash. John Nash goes back to Princeton where he knows the environment. He gets in a familiar set of relationships. They even let him teach, so he's contributing to the lives of others. And guess what? The guy from the Nobel Prize Committee comes up after his class, you know, and taps him on the shoulder and says, I'm from the Nobel Prize Committee. There's a young undergraduate walking out of Nash's class, and he taps her on the shoulder and he says, young lady, would you please tell me, is this gentleman here real? And she says, yeah, So, that was this in action. So I'm trying to make a simple point here, this is great stuff. Patient outcomes, everybody's talking about a right to health care, Obamacare. Can I just mention that 20% of every health care dollar goes for non-adherence. That is to say, people who aren't following up on their drugs, who aren't following up on treatments, who just aren't taking good care of themselves for a whole variety of reasons. 20% right there, non-adherence to treatment. And when you think about it, for a lot of people in this society, why should I care for myself? I mean, in the great spiritual traditions and Christian tradition, we have a notion of stewardship. I care for my body because my body isn't mine. My body is a gift from God. My life is a gift from God. I use my life for what? To contribute to the lives of others, And therefore, I have a reason to care about myself. Because, personally, if I'm just me, myself, and I, that ain't terribly interesting, right? So that's stewardship. And it's noted in various studies now that the strongest indicator of whether patients will adhere to treatment and take care of themselves is whether they can feel compassionate love from their primary clinician. And you can look at studies now on people managing the epidemic of diabetes. You get much better LDL cholesterol control and glucose control when patients can say that their doctors are empathic. E. E. Cummings, great Christian poet, said, "We do not believe in ourselves until someone reveals that something deep inside us is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch." I would call that unconditional love. I would call that agape. Immune strength. Paul McClelland, Harvard, the Mother Teresa effect. He takes undergraduates. He has the subjects watch mothers of Mother Teresa in Calcutta, films of Mother Teresa. The controls, just watch something emotionally neutral, like potato peeling. I say that I maybe I have to reveal that I'm half Irish, and my grandparents had a potato farm, and I used to hear a lot of Irish humor at the table. So just to thrill you with a little mirth, what's the Irish definition of hospitality? You make someone feel perfectly at home while you'd be wishing they were. No, just kidding. I can say that and be politically correct because I'm half Irish. But anyway, the ones who were watching Mother Teresa, salivary gamma globulin, a good measure of immune strength, up significantly. Then McClellan split that subject group into two. He had half of the people just meditate or contemplate helping others, and their gamma globulin levels stayed high, whereas those who didn't go through that internal exercise, he called it dwelling on love, went back down to baseline. And you can Google this, Mother Teresa effect, guarantee you'll find tens and hundreds of thousands of references to it. Okay? We're just about over here. Now look, some of you think that when you retire, to be happy, here's what you're thinking. I'm going to Sun City so I can get up at noon and have my first martini. Forget about it. Because we now have studies at 7 or 8 great universities, Brown, Stanford, Michigan, you name it, and it shows following older adults from, say, age 65 to 80 or 70 to 85 or whatever it might be, that after you factor out all of the health baseline considerations and confounders, the ones who can report that they are volunteering, formally or involuntarily or informally involved in helping activities, they're living longer, they're having lower depression rates. How much longer? 2 years. 2 years, right? And if you go to assisted living centers now all around the United States, you don't find this medical model like the nursing home thing where people are just passively lying in their bed waiting for somebody to bring them meals on wheels. No, You have whole wings of good assisted living programs which are devoted to community volunteerism. Older folks excited about printing shirts for the next walkathon, right? That's what's going on. In California, in the Bay Area, geriatricians are prescribing volunteering to geriatric patients. Again, consistent with their physical strength and their interests. It's important that they do things that they feel motivated about, that they work from strengths. They don't just think they're spinning their wheels. And that they have an opportunity to reconvene and kind of share and form relationships around helping activities. So that Sun City business, forget about it. Now, this is a guy who never went to Sun City to retire because he was too much of a giver. That guy on the left is Sir John Templeton, and the one on his right is his brother Harvey. Sir John Templeton said, "Who are the happiest people you've ever met? Let us write down the names of 10 persons who continually bubble over with happiness, and we will probably find that most are men and women who radiate love for everyone." So that's a little picture of me and Sir John a while ago, admittedly. I was sitting in my office in the medical school at Case Western Reserve University in June of 2001. I got a fax from Sir John, who lived down in Nassau. He was a great investor, one of the greatest investors of his generation, and he decided that he was going to take all that money and start a foundation to study great human spiritual assets: forgiveness, kindness, generosity, agape love. So I got this fax from him. He didn't email. He wasn't into emailing. He was 88 at the time, and he thought the fax was the single greatest machine ever invented. So I got this fax from Sir John. "Stephen, we should start an institute that doesn't study human deficit and disease, but really that studies the greatest human spiritual assets." So I faxed back to him, "Sir John, what should we call it? It's a great idea." He said, in his fax, "The Institute for Research on Unlimited Love." Now here I'm in Cleveland, around the Cleveland Clinic, Case Western. I've got a lot of research going on, especially on Alzheimer's disease. And I'm thinking to myself, this could be a PR problem. My friends are going to ask me, "Post, what kind of love are we talking about here?" And I'm going to explain it, because I believe in this stuff, but they might not. So I was running a little bit of a risk. So I faxed back to Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism, because altruism is a nice, dry, sciencey, arid, technical thing that couldn't inspire a mole rat. So I sent that back to him, and he faxed back to me. He said, "No, I think unlimited love, $8.9 million. And I think I did what Francis would have done. I faxed back to him immediately. "Sir John, I love that language. It jumps right off the page. Jumps right off the page, you know." And we were able, with Byron's help, Byron assisted us, you know, we funded, 70 or 80 great studies that have really put this discussion on the map in terms of really, you know, for Sir John, unlimited love was agape love, you know, but, you know, he wanted something that was a little more understandable by a wider population. But made a lot of impact and did national surveys on people's experience of divine love and how it enhanced their capacity to love their neighbor. We just had a wonderful time with it, and I owe it all to a wonderful man. So I'll just go back to Sir John. Who are the happiest people you've ever met? Most are men and women who radiate love for everyone. Thanks. We got a little time for Q&A. Comments? Yes, ma'am. Shout it out.
Have you been studying, or do you know of studies or something like you could read or anything that talks about the effect of more generous public policy on whole communities or something like that? You know what I'm saying? Like for example, healthcare or generous food stamps or benefits or countries that have.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting. You know, I mean, you know, public policy is significant. Actually, in the international happiness scales, I will say that the Scandinavian countries come out pretty high. And I know that they do have an awful lot of social policy that supports the most vulnerable amongst them. And when they respond in some greater depth, they tend to say that they do find gratification in living in a society that shows that kind of equal regard. But I do think that more broadly, what we're seeing is that when people have real communities, when they have as individuals opportunities to be engaged in helping others, that's really the key. So, even look at the architecture in our world today. I go to a very Victorian place sometimes in the summer called the Chautauqua Institute up in upstate New York. It's all Victorian design. You've got big porches, you've got wonderful pathways between houses, and everybody's engaging with one another, helping one another. It's just incredibly neighborly, Nowadays, you look at architecture, and there's no sidewalks typically in new developments. There's no porches. You sort of go in there with your car. It's like a place to put your car pod, And then of course everybody's behind their devices. DSM-5, by the way, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, just coming out, will have a long section on addiction to video games and how that creates attention deficit disorder, which is then in turn treated with addictive drugs. Talk about a vicious cycle. I think it's mainly about community. I don't think that policy is irrelevant in these regards at all, but it's more about what we do face-to-face for one another on a daily basis that I think makes the difference. Someone else. Okay, who else? Someone else. I know, back in that row. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Where did you begin learning about or studying or being interested in this? Was it at medical school when you were studying, or was it a recent project of yours? And where do you intend to go with this line of study after finishing the book?
Well, thanks. It's more, I guess, more autobiographical, but real briefly, I had the opportunity when I was about 12 years old to go to a Christian high school in Concord, New Hampshire. It was called St. Paul's. It was an Episcopal school, and a school that was really committed to Christian values. And when I was 15, I had a African-American Episcopal priest who taught me a course on agape love, looking at especially the African-American tradition that came out of Morehouse College in Atlanta. So Martin Luther King, Daddy King, Martin Luther King Jr., Howard Thurman, Benjamin Elijah Mays, all these people, by the way, who were the first ones to go over to India in 1935 and meet Gandhi and bring the idea of nonviolence into the civil rights movement. And by the way, this was the Reverend John Walker. There's now a park in his name in Washington, D.C. He left St. Paul's and he became the dean of the National Cathedral. He was the only African-American on the faculty. And so he was very affectionately referred to. Times changed, and I say this with great reverence because we were so close. And he was also the mentor to John Kerry, who went to St. Paul's about 12 years before I did. But we honorably referred to him, and he would laugh. We called him Johnny Walker Black. I say that with great love, but he was the person. And then, so, as I went on in life, I always tried to stick with this theme, whether I was in college studying biology and altruism and bees, or whatever I was doing, whether I was in, I was studying immunology at Penn for a little while, and thinking about how the body is affected by emotions and how helping others can trigger positive emotions and that kind of thing. And then I went off to the University of Chicago Divinity School, and I decided I wasn't going to be a scientist because I'm not an MD. And I I just studied everything I could about the theology of agape love and studied world religions and then sort of got into the medical humanities there at the end of my period, but have always been committed to this, and I've been very lucky. You know, nobody realizes this sometimes, but we really don't create our lives so much. I think personally that God sends certain people into our lives and we respond to them, hopefully with a lot of devotion and dedication to our tasks, because it's so much a matter of passing the torch. You know, we love, here's a passage that we all need to know, we love because he first loved us. We love because he first, you know, human nature is not terribly pretty. You look at these studies on human compassion, you know, Milgram and the prison experiments out at Stanford. You take good everyday people just like you, give you an opportunity to be bullying, and about 2/3 of you will be pretty quickly under the right circumstances. So human nature is a mixed bag. But we love because he first loved us. I once had a discussion with the Dalai Lama in Sydney, Australia, at the 4th International Conference on Happiness and Its Consequences. And we disagreed a little bit because he said, you know, the only thing that matters, you know, do you become compassionate? That's it. Doesn't matter what you believe. And I said, you know, but my problem is that I look at all the terrible news that's constantly repeated on, you know, every kind of, you know, CNN, Fox, whatever it is. It's just a litany of negative stuff. And I say, you know, I don't think sometimes that I could really get up in the morning and think my goal, my mission today is to love my neighbor under God. I don't think I could do that as well if I didn't think that somewhere at the beginning of the universe it was love that set the whole thing in motion. And if I didn't think that it was love, God's love, that was revealed in Christ and in great spiritual figures, and if I didn't think that somehow that love would be fully unveiled at the end of time, I think it makes a difference. I think what you think, what you feel, I think faith makes a difference. So we had that conversation. It was very pleasant. And we're both pretty humorous folks, and so there were some jokes going around. You know, what did the Zen Buddhists say to the hot dog vendor? Do you know that? Make me one with everything, and so forth, you know. But I do think that what we believe makes a difference. So I've just been lucky. I've been the luckiest guy on the face of the earth, and I've met guys like Byron Johnson along the way, and I'm always grateful to him.
Join me in thanking Stephen Post for a great lecture.